Hi everybody, welcome to week 5. This is Evan from Codify. This week is primarily about Bootstrap, Twitter Bootstrap, which is a library or framework which is going to make writing CSS and laying down quick layouts for sites extremely easy. Much easier than we've been doing up to this point. So let's get started. Number 1, how do you connect pages on a multi-page website? Well, each page of your website, let's say you have the home page, which is your index.html, and an about page, which is an entirely separate website, or page on your website, rather. That about page is also going to be powered by a .html document. So it's probably going to be something like inside your project folder, you'll have an additional HTML file. Let's call this one about.html. So now it's sitting right next to my index. And in order to access this page from my home page, we're simply going to use a regular old anchor tag. What's going to set this apart from the usual anchor tags is the href, the hyperlink reference, is actually going to be about.html. So I'm going to copy all of this code, paste in an about.html, change the text, and we'll see it in action. Okay, so in my index.html, I have an h1 that says this is my home page, and an anchor which leads to about.html that says to the about page. On the about page, I have an h1 that says this is my about page, with an anchor that leads to index.html linking to the home page. Okay, so I'm going to open index.html in browser. If I click on to the about page, loads the about page, to the home page, about page, and back and forth. So I've thereby linked 2 pages in a multi-page website. Many websites, especially those which have a lot of different pages, will have a lot of different HTML files. That said, it's becoming more and more popular, especially for more manageable businesses or smaller scale businesses, independent businesses. It's become much more popular for them to make use of what are called single page websites, which are exactly what you might expect. They're one long single page website with all of the information about the business contained on that single page, only in different sections. A good example might be something like Bright Scout. Now this is actually a multi-page website. They do have more than just one page, but most of their content is contained on their home page. Sorry, looks like my computer's having some trouble loading it. There we go. So this is the Bright Scout homepage. Still not loading. I'll come back to it. Number 2, what is a CDN? Why would you use it? Why would you not use it? CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. Content Delivery Network. And believe it or not, we've been using a CDN already. We are currently using a CDN for Font Awesome, a content delivery network. All this is a hyperlink, this hyperlink, which connects an external style sheet or an external script page to our index.html without us having to download it, include it in our project folder, and link it to our index.html. We still have to link the external hyperlink, just like this. But unlike how we handled animate.css, we don't actually have the Font Awesome style sheet. We don't actually have the Font Awesome style sheet. We are linking to a third-party external URL in order to access that style sheet. In the case of animate.css, we downloaded animate.css, saved it in our CSS folder, and linked it to our HTML just like we did main.css. So why would you use a CDN? Well, they're pretty convenient. It's pretty convenient that you can just... Wow, this page really doesn't want to load. It's pretty convenient that you can just link an external style sheet using a URL to your HTML without having to download the files and possibly change your project folder structure. They're convenient and easy to use, and they get you off the ground running right away. But they require internet access, which means if you need to work on a project on a long plane ride, or for whatever reason don't see yourself having access to Wi-Fi while you're coding, your CDNs won't work. So that's one major consideration to keep in mind. CDNs can also be helpful in that the code on the other end of those URLs is frequently updated. Right now, for example, Font Awesome is in version 5.0.10. That's liable to change sometime soon. And when that happens, the CDN that I'm using will update with it. I'll have access to all of the updated code. That can either be really good or really bad for you if it's a huge update. Also, things to keep in mind. Once you download the Font Awesome style sheet, for example, it's not going to change. The local version that you have in your project folder is never going to change or update. Okay, so this is Sprite Scout. Looks like it's loaded. And as I scroll down, they have things pop in. But this is really the entirety of their value proposition. They do have a separate page. They have like a Get Started page, which is how you inquire about project pricing and things like that. But most of their website is contained on this homepage powered by oneindex.html. And this is a very straightforward example of single page websites, which are becoming more popular. Bright Scout is not a very optimized website, as you can see. It has a lot of loading issues, which is something to bear in mind if you're using a lot of image-heavy graphics, or in this case, I believe these are SVGs. We're not really going to talk about them in this course. It's beyond the scope of this course, but SVGs are excellent. I love them. However, they are a beast when it comes to how they affect your site's load times, so you do need to be careful. Moving on. Number 3, what is Bootstrap? Bootstrap is a library or framework that we can use to streamline our workflow like crazy. So let's talk for a minute about how to get set up with Bootstrap. We're going to be using a CDN for Bootstrap. We're not going to download it, not at this juncture. So to get set up with Bootstrap, we want to go to a site called getbootstrap.com. Getbootstrap.com. This is an extremely important website for you to know. If there's one thing you take away from this whole lecture, it should be getbootstrap.com. Now once you're at getbootstrap.com, I'm going to click on Get Started. Not download, but Get Started. And here in this Quick Start section, there's a CSS section and a JS section. All we need to do is copy this link tag inside the CSS section. I can highlight it and copy it, or you can click this little button here that says Copy to Clipboard. And once I have it copied, I'm going to paste it somewhere above my own custom main.css. Okay, here's my main.css. I've pasted Bootstrap above it. Even in terms of the order in which you connect CSS style sheets to your page, cascading style sheets, the cascading nature of those style sheets still applies, which is to say, I want my own custom main.css style sheet to be able to override Bootstrap or Animate or Font Awesome if it has to. So I always want to keep it at the bottom. Alright, that's step 1. I copied over the link. Step 2 is in the JS section. We have these 3 script tags. 3 script tags. We haven't dealt with script tags before. This will be a first for us. But I'm going to copy all 3 and I paste them at the bottom of my body. Okay, I paste them just before my closing body tag. What I recommend is creating a comment that says something like scripts, just to label them and set them apart from the rest of your core code, which is going to go up here. Okay, so we brought over 3 scripts for Bootstrap, and I'm going to just explain very quickly what they are. It's something we'll get into much more deeply in next week's material. But scripts are for JavaScript. They power JavaScript code. This first script is a script for jQuery. You may have heard of jQuery while searching around the internet or looking into coding. Maybe you've even used it before. But jQuery is really a library for JavaScript that allows for some cleaner code in some scenarios. So it allows some streamlining of JavaScript. Not important right now. Then there's this Popper. Popper is the second script. And Popper is a very niche library. It really does one thing, and that's create pop-ups, pop-up tooltips and things like that. You don't need to know what Popper does. I just want you to be aware. And finally, Bootstrap.js. Bootstrap.js. The reason Bootstrap loads last is because Bootstrap depends on both of these scripts. Bootstrap requires jQuery and Popper in order to work properly. The way this works is the code that is written in the bootstrap.js file uses both jQuery and Popper. It uses jQuery syntax and it uses some Popper functions. If we did not have these top 2 scripts, then when the browser tries to read bootstrap.js, it's going to come across some jQuery syntax or some Popper functions that it will not recognize, it will not know how to read, and it's going to throw an error. And when the browser throws an error, all JavaScript stops. So none of this will have any effect. As a result, we need to load specifically in this order: jQuery, Popper, and then Bootstrap, so that one by one, the browser, whenever it loads our page, has the tools necessary to correctly read the Bootstrap script. Okay? This is also why we include scripts at the bottom of our body. We can include them in the head, like we do with our link tags, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But on the off chance that any one of our scripts has any kind of an error, as soon as the browser encounters that error, everything stops loading. Everything stops loading. So if we had these scripts in our head, the browser tries to load our page, it throws an error, it stops, we end up with a blank website. By putting our scripts at the bottom of our body tag like this, at the very least, even if there's an error and none of them run, we're ensuring that all of our HTML actually loads, it actually renders. So we actually have a website for our visitors to look at and interact with, even if our scripts are broken. And that's why we put them at the bottom of our body. With that, we are set up for Bootstrap. Okay, now using Bootstrap, let me go back to getbootstrap.com. Using Bootstrap is a mix of learning some patterns, learning some new class names, and taking advantage of Bootstrap components. Bootstrap components are one of the most popular features of Bootstrap. To take a look at these components, you go to getbootstrap.com, click on Documentation up here at the top, and in this sidebar menu, there is a section called Components. So I'm going to click on that. Note that if you don't see this sidebar, or if you don't see components, it probably means that your window is too small, in which case you can expand the menu that contains that sidebar by clicking on this little hamburger button up at the top, just underneath the purple section. You can expand it, and there's components. Click the hamburger button or make your window larger. It's up to you. And in components, there are all of these different types of components: alerts, badge, breadcrumb, buttons, button group, card, carousel. Let's take a look at buttons real fast. Okay, these are Bootstrap buttons. And this is an example of every type of button that Bootstrap supports. Button primary, button secondary, button success, button danger, etc. Okay, if you've watched the videos for this week, by now you're familiar with components and how they work. You're familiar with how to look for the patterns in these class names. But this is a reminder that you can find a lot of these components here in Bootstrap's documentation. That when using Bootstrap components, the goal is not to memorize the code. You know, a button is easy, but if you're dealing with an image carousel like this, or even better, like this one with controls, if you're dealing with an image carousel, this is a lot of code. This is a lot of code, and it includes code which you might not be familiar with or might not be confident interpreting. The goal is not to memorize this code. Over time, you may be able to recreate this on your own, and that's excellent. But right now, the goal is to come to Bootstrap's documentation, come to the components section, copy the code that you need, and paste it in your HTML. If you have not yet watched the videos for this week, where I go into detail about the components and other Bootstrap class patterns, or the utility classes, the grid system, then I strongly suggest stopping here and watching those videos first. Alright, why do we like Bootstrap? We like Bootstrap because it lets us do a lot of things really easily and really quickly, especially writing CSS. It allows us to do an awful lot of styling with little to no CSS. Not that we don't like CSS, we love CSS, but Bootstrap makes rapid prototyping of websites, rapid layouts. It gets rid of some of the tedium of CSS and lets us focus on the more important things. What version of Bootstrap are we using, and how can we be sure we're using the correct version? Well, we are using version 4, specifically 4.1. And you can always make sure that you're using the correct version by checking the version number in your link tag or your scripts. Right here, 4.1. That's liable to change. Pretty soon it'll be 4.2 or 4.1.5. That's fine. But you should always be aware of what version you're using. What you don't want to be using is Bootstrap version 3, which is very much still out there. We only recently made the switch to Bootstrap 4. Okay, so no Bootstrap 3, no Bootstrap 4 Alpha, no Bootstrap 4 Beta, Bootstrap 4. Where can we go to find the documentation for Bootstrap or Bootstrap component code? You go to getbootstrap.com. Getbootstrap.com. What are the two ways we talked about connecting Bootstrap to your project? CDNs, which I just showed you again, or downloading it. You can download it. I don't recommend that at this point. most of the time when you're using CDNs, you use them during development. And as soon as you finish a project, as soon as you're done with a site and you want to deploy it live or turn it over to a client, that is when you go and download all of the external style sheets and script pages from your CDNs, and you save them into your project folder and relink them. Okay, CDNs are typically more for development. Downloading is typically more for deployment. When using Bootstrap's grid system, what containing element class or classes do we need? The foundational element in Bootstrap's grid system is an element with a class of either container or container fluid. Now I'm using a div here. I almost exclusively use divs when I'm coding in Bootstrap, but that's not a hard and fast rule. There's nothing saying that this can't be a section or a main or any other large block dividing element. Okay, I use divs because they're easy, they're consistent, and the classes pretty much do the job of distinguishing the role of this element anyway. So we always need to start with either a container or a container fluid. The difference between the two, let me go ahead and give this div a background color. I'll add the class of bg-danger, and that's going to give it a red background color. It also needs a height, however. So okay, so this is our container div right here. This is our container div. Note the white space along the sides. If you inspect this with your inspector, you'll see that that white space is actually margin. Margin. Okay, so containers have an automatic margin to the left and right. That can be nice. It can be useful. It can create some nice negative space on your page. And a lot of business and websites do take advantage of that. On the other hand, there's a container fluid, which stretches all the way from one side of the page to the other. No white space, no negative space. Okay, so a container or container fluid is the foundational element in Bootstrap's grid system. Note that containers or container fluids can be nested inside other elements. There's no reason why you can't take advantage of the automatic margin applied by a container inside of, say, a nav bar. If you don't want your logo all the way in the top left and your links all the way in the top right, if you want them pushed in a little bit on both sides, you could simply put a container inside your nav element and the rest of your content inside of that container. Get creative. All right. What's the difference between Bootstrap's container and container fluid? We just addressed that. How many columns are in each row in Bootstrap's grid system? The answer is 12. In each horizontal row in Bootstrap's grid system, there are 12 columns. But let's take a moment and talk about what a row is. Inside this container fluid here, I could start using the grid system. I could start creating columned divs just fine. In fact, let's do that real fast. Hopefully you've watched the videos up to this point. So you're at least a little bit familiar with how the grid system works and what these column divs are. Okay, now I created two columns. Let me give them a fat padding to the top and bottom too. I created two columns, one green, one yellow, and they are both 6 columns wide. Now, with a maximum of 12 columns in any given row, we should expect that these columns are able to sit next to each other and take up the full width of the page. collectively. However, they're not doing that. They're stacking. And if I inspect these, remember, always use your inspector. Always try to dig a little deeper, find out what's going on under the hood. So if I inspect these, if I hover my inspector over them, it shows me that they have all of this margin to the right, extending across the page, each of them. This is the behavior of a block element. Okay, so in vanilla CSS, what we would do is we would take both of these divs and we would give them the property of display inline block or inline so that they would sit next to each other, right? We want to try to do as much as possible in Bootstrap without writing CSS for the sake of these exercises. And what that should tell you really is that there is a way to do that. There is a way to cause both of these divs, both of these column divs, to behave like inline block elements rather than block elements. And the element that we're missing, the piece that we're missing in that equation is a row element, or a div with a class of row. If I add a row inside my container fluid and shift both of these columns inside that row, they'll sit next to each other perfectly. Okay? So takeaway is that you can use the grid system inside a container or container fluid, but to really take advantage of the grid system, to really get the full features of Bootstrap's layout tools, and to cause elements to sit next to each other exactly the way you want, you need to put them inside of a row. Once inside of a row, the columns will sit next to each other all the way. They'll sit next to each other so long as they collectively add up to 12 or less. The second that you exceed 12 columns, they'll simply wrap to the next line. And you can get as precise as you'd like with your layout by taking advantage of this grid system. So you do need a row, and the role of that row is that it allows the elements inside to sit next to each other. 12 columns in each row. Now what does col6 mean? col-6. This means that this div is going to occupy 6 columns at every screen size. Okay, when you see nothing between column and the number, it indicates the columns that this div is going to occupy, that this element is going to occupy at every screen size. But for the next question, what does col-12 space col-md-6 mean? Well, if we change this to col12, col-md-6, that changes the meaning. Okay, this still means the same thing. This means that at every screen size, this div is going to occupy 12 columns, so the full width of the row. But at a medium screen size, and all the way up, from a medium screen size upwards, it will occupy 6 columns. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. I'm going to bring in my window. 12 columns. It's occupying 12 columns, the full width of the row. But as soon as we hit a medium screen, I'm super zoomed in, aren't I? Yep. Okay. As soon as we hit a medium-sized screen, it jumps to 6 columns, or 50% of the row. 6 is half of 12, so now it's going to occupy 50% of the row at all future screen sizes until we drop below medium again. So it's 12 columns at extra small, 12 columns at small, 6 columns at medium, 6 columns at large, and 6 columns at extra large. And of course, we could continue to add to this to add additional breakpoints. Maybe I want it to only occupy 4 columns at an extra large screen. 6 and 4. 6, 4. Okay, so with these classes, with this grid system, we can be incredibly precise in how all of our page, every single element on our page behaves, how our layout behaves and transforms based on screen size. We can take very, very tight control of our layout. As a Bootstrap class, what do you think text-center does? What do you think text-center does? Well, let's try it on this column. Text center applies text align center. Makes sense. What about text white? Let's try that one. Makes our text white. Surprise, surprise. What about background dark? Well, we've seen that. Gives us a dark background. W100. W100. W100 gives an element a width of 100%. 100%. And that's going to be 100% of its containing element, of its parent. 100% of its parent. What does image fluid do? Image fluid gives an image a max width of 100%. So you may have seen this in the videos already. Image fluid causes an image to scale down so that it never exceeds the width of its parent container. So if I threw an image inside this div here, and reloaded my page, PNG. The image overflows like crazy. Okay, but I can give my image a class of image fluid. And that's going to give the image a max width of 100%. So it's never going to exceed 100% of the width of its parent. It's a very useful class for images. You might think, how is that different than W100? Well, in this case, it's not. In this case, it's going to have the exact same effect. But width 100 will force an image to be 100% of its parent, even if that parent is enormous. Even if that parent is enormous. On the other hand, image fluid applies max width, not width. So that means the image will stop growing once it has hit its maximum resolution. With image fluid, you don't run the risk of very, very pixelated, low resolution images. Sometimes you need an image to be the full length, the full width of its parent, so you might use W100 and force it. But image fluid is generally safer. What does the MX Auto class do? What are some variations of this class? Well, let's apply this class to my div. I'm going to give it a class of MX Auto, and it causes it to center. MX Auto applies margin 0 auto. Automatic margin to the left and right. It centers any block element or inline block element. Okay, now the variations are, we can do MR auto, margin right auto, or margin left auto, ML auto. And what this is going to do is cause the div to push as hard as it can against its left side, which is going to cause it to justify to the right. Okay, now let's experiment with this just a little bit more. I'm going to get rid of ML auto for now. And I'm going to make this div simply 3 columns wide. I'm going to replicate it, duplicate it 2 more times. Okay, now let's say I want to center all of these 3 divs. Well, I could certainly apply MX auto to each of them, like so. But that's going to cause them to center within the space available to them. Make sense? They're all pushing against each other. They're centered within their respective space, but they're not centered together the way I was hoping. To achieve that effect, there are a couple different ways, but using margin classes, what we need to do is apply ML auto to that first div and MR auto to that last div. And there you go. They sandwich together. Okay, what does offset for do? Well, the offset class is an alternative way to achieve this effect. Let me go ahead and get rid of all of the margin classes here. I can, well, let's see, we have 3 columns, 3 columns, and 3 columns for a total of 9. That's actually tough because we have a remainder of 3. Well, what offset allows us to do is cause this first column, for example, to be offset by 2 columns. Which means of those remaining 3 columns, 2 of them are kept empty here on the left side. This first div, it's 3 columns wide, but it is offset by 2 empty columns. Or offset by 1 empty column. Okay, so offset can be a helpful way to handle this as well. But in this specific example, we have a remainder of 3, and what we cannot do is offset 1.5. That's just going to break it. We cannot offset by a column and a half. So the offset class is only so helpful. It's not helpful in every situation. If we want to center these 3 column divs perfectly, offset is not going to help us, unfortunately. In other cases it will, and it's a good thing to know, but the margin utility classes are, in my opinion, much more helpful. Alright, where can you go to learn more about these and other Bootstrap classes? Well, once again, getbootstrap.com. You go into their documentation section, and there is a layout section, there's a utilities section, and all of this documentation is excellent to read if you're interested in learning more. But for example, inside layout, they have an explanation of the grid system. They have a layout section for media objects, like images. They have all the utility classes for layouts. There are, in fact, display classes for Bootstrap, visibility classes for Bootstrap. All the margin and padding classes are right here. It's 3 paragraphs. You can read that. And let's see, where else? In utilities is another good place to go. Utilities, let's click on display and take a look at those display properties, display classes. So you use D hyphen and then a value, like none, inline block, table cell, table row flex, inline flex. You don't know all of these, and that's fine. But think about it. If I need to hide this image, I can simply give it a class of D none. And now that first image is going to disappear. Display none. Easy as that. More importantly, let's say the image is hidden at all screen sizes, but at a medium screen size, I want it to display again. So display none, display none, display none, display block. Okay, so we can add those screen size breakpoints, those utility classes, as part of a number of these other patterns of utility classes that we see that we're using. You can use these breakpoints not just in the display classes, but also in the padding classes, the margin classes, obviously the column classes. You need to think about on your own where else you can use them and maybe start experimenting. Start thinking about how that could really, really help your layout. And once again, we have written 0 CSS at this point. All right, when we connect Bootstrap to our HTML, we use a link tag in our head. Does this link tag for Bootstrap come before or after our link tag for our main.css file, and why? Well, I already addressed this. We always want our main.css file to have the most precedence because that's our custom style sheet. And so it is always going to be at the bottom. Where does jQuery go on your HTML pages if you're using Bootstrap's JavaScript? Well, all of our scripts go at the bottom of our body. And once again, we need jQuery to load first before Bootstrap. So jQuery goes above it. jQuery, then Popper, then Bootstrap.